Today, we are digging into one of the most, well, persistent and often misunderstood concepts in political economy, laissez faire.
It really is. It's a French phrase, of course, that somehow survives centuries of, intense debate. Literally, it translates to let it them do.
Right, but it's usually shorthand for that longer sort of foundational motto, laissez faire, laissez passer.
Exactly. Meaning roughly let do and let pass. Let things happen, let things move.
And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to show you that this simple phrase, which describes an economy supposedly free from any government intervention, no subsidies, no regulations, no tariffs,
Zero interference.
it has a history that's way more complex, even contradictory, than that simple definition might suggest. We're going to peel back the layers. Where did it come from? How was it actually applied? And, well, why is it still such a lightning rod today?
Yeah, and to really get it, you have to start with the philosophy behind it all. I mean, laissez-faire rests on these core principles that, while they feel very Western Enlightenment, but they're actually pretty radical when you unpack them.
Like what, specifically?
Well, first, the idea that the individual, you, me, everyone, is the basic, almost sacred unit of society. Second, that this individual has a natural and inherent right to freedom that shouldn't be touched.
Okay.
And maybe most importantly, this belief, and it is a belief, that the physical order of nature, the world itself, is this harmonious, self-regulating system.
And government interference can only mess it up.
That's the core idea. It can only disrupt that natural harmony.
Okay, and here's the hook right away, because you just said it sounds so European, so Enlightenment. But where does this rumor come from about Chinese philosophical origins? That seems kind of out of left field.
It's an incredible little historical footnote, isn't it? One of the first French guys to really popularize the concept, a man named Vincent de Gournay, he apparently adopted the core idea, or was at least heavily influenced by Chinese philosophy, specifically Taoism.
Wow.
Yeah, he drew from this concept called Wu Wei, that's W-U-W-E-I, and it basically means non-action or non-intervention.
So the idea that the best way to govern is,
Mm-hmm.
well, not to govern.
Exactly. Let things flow naturally. It's fascinating that this supposedly Western idea might have these Eastern roots.
That really sets things up nicely. So let's trace the actual phrase back to that famous French origin story. It supposedly takes place, what, late 17th century?
That's the one. We're talking France under the height of mercantilism, where the state was heavily involved in controlling and directing pretty much all trade.
Total control.
Pretty much. And you have the powerful Controller General of Finances, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He was basically the king's money man meeting with a group of French businessmen. This is around 1681. And Colbert, being a good mercantilist, wants to figure out how the state can help boost French exports, through support and planning. So he asks them, point blank, how can the state best help you promote commerce?
And their leader, a guy named Monsieur Legendre, gives this incredibly blunt, short answer that basically becomes the slogan for the whole doctrine.
He just says, laissez-nous faire.
Leave it to us, or maybe even let us do our thing.
Exactly. Just get out of the way. Stop interfering.
And this idea, this phrase, it really catches fire later in the 18th century, right? With that group called the physiocrats.
Yes, the physiocrats were key. If you actually break down their name, physiocracy, it means rule of nature. They had this core belief that all real wealth came purely from the land, from agriculture.
Because that's natural production.
Right. And since they saw nature as operating harmoniously, they figured the economy should too. It followed logically for them.
So because they believed in this natural order of liberty, their big argument was that if individuals just chase their own economic self-interest,
Their selfish interest. Yeah.
they'd somehow unintentionally end up contributing to the overall good of society.
Precisely. The invisible hand idea, even before Smith really popularized it. So for the physiocrats, the state's job was super limited. Basically just protect property rights, protect personal freedom, and otherwise step back completely.
Okay, but this theory got put to the test pretty quickly, didn't it? And not in the good way.
No, not at all. It ran smack into human suffering.
Yeah.
King Louis V, who was, influenced by these physiocratic ideas, decided to try it out. In 1754, he abolished all the tolls on grain transport within France.
Yeah. A move towards pure laissez-faire, trying to make things more efficient.
That was the goal. But then disaster struck. A really poor harvest hit hard in 1768.
Oh boy. So wait, you're saying the very first major policy experiment based on this let it be idea,
Yeah.
it failed? Spectacularly.
Absolutely spectacularly. Because the merchants, now completely free to sell grain wherever they could get the highest price, remember, no regulations, no export controls,
Mm.
they started exporting grain for huge profits, selling it abroad, while people in France were facing mass starvation.
Wow. So the ideology, the theory, just trumped basic survival.
It did in that case. Abstract trade theory over human welfare. It led to widespread riots, total social unrest, and the government was actually forced to revoke the edict in 1770. It was a very harsh, very public lesson on the potential downsides, the potential cruelty of the doctrine when applied rigidly.
It's also really important to realize, though, that while the phrase laissez-faire was maybe crystallizing then, the underlying idea, the legal concept of the individual and their property being paramount, that wasn't new, was it?
Not at all. That's a crucial point. You can trace the idea that the state shouldn't really meddle in private commerce way, way back, all the way to Roman private law, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Roman law.
Yeah, between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, that legal tradition really developed and established the theory of absolute private property rights and the freedom to trade, the freedom to make contracts. So in a lot of ways, laissez-faire was just sort of reviving or maybe repackaging this very deep-seated Western legal heritage of individualism.
Okay, so the 18th century then brings us to, well, the person everyone associates with this idea, Adam Smith. This is where laissez-faire really starts to take shape as the defining philosophy of modern capitalism, right?
Absolutely. Adam Smith is central. His book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, it wasn't just an economic blueprint. Smith saw it almost as a kind of moral program.
A moral program. How so?
He believed this system would restore what he saw as the natural law rights of individuals, and by doing that, it would unleash huge potential for national prosperity, for growth. It was about freedom and wealth creation.
But here's a fascinating little detail, a linguistic point you mentioned earlier.
Uh,
While Smith is like the philosophical godfather of non-intervention,
He never actually used the French phrase laissez-faire himself, not once in The Wealth of Nations.
really? So what did he use?
He used a different, now equally famous, metaphor, the invisible hand. It's a concept he actually borrowed, or at least was influenced by, from an earlier writer, Bernard de Mandeville, and his Fable of the Bees.
Ah, okay. And the invisible hand describes.
It describes those unintentional but positive social and economic benefits that just emerge naturally when millions of individuals simply pursue their own self-interest in the marketplace. It's the idea of spontaneous economic self-organization.
So Smith provides this powerful intellectual framework. But when this framework, this doctrine, gets tested by a real crisis, it sometimes revealed, well, a shocking kind of rigidity, didn't it? We see this very starkly in Britain during the Irish famine.
Yeah, the mid-1840s. That period, especially around 1847, is probably one of the most chilling examples of pure laissez-faire ideology put into practice. Despite catastrophic potato blight, mass starvation, people dying in the streets, many prominent British leaders, thinkers, commentators, they clung rigidly to the belief that the state must not intervene in the market. Providing food aid, they argued, would just distort the natural mechanisms of supply and demand. It would create dependency.
And that infamous quote from the founder, the economist James Wilson, really captures that brutal logic.
It really does, Wilson wrote quite starkly. It is no man's business to provide for another.
Wow.
It's a shocking statement to modern ears, but it reflects just how deeply that ideology had taken root. This idea that abstract market mechanics were somehow more sacred, more important than preventing mass death, and that strict adherence ensured hundreds of thousands perished even while food was technically available elsewhere, including in Quebec itself.
Just devastating.
Yeah.
Yet, at roughly the same time, there was another big push happening in Britain related to free trade,
Yeah.
championed by people like Richard Cobden and John Bright, the Manchester Liberals.
That's right. This was the campaign against the Corn Laws. These were basically high tariffs, taxes on imported grain.
Designed to keep prices high.
Exactly. Primarily designed to protect the incomes of the wealthy landed aristocracy by keeping bread prices artificially high for everyone else, especially the working poor.
So, the opposite of free trade.
Totally. And the Manchester Liberals fought hard against this. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 was seen as a massive victory for the spirit of free trade, for laissez-faire principles in a way. It helped open up global markets.
But sadly, it came too late to really help with the famine unfolding across the Irish Sea.
Tragically, yes. The timing was just off. The repeal was a landmark moment for free trade theory, But it couldn't stop the immediate humanitarian disaster in Ireland that was happening partly because of a rigid adherence to another aspect of the same doctrine.
Okay, let's shift gears now and cross the Atlantic. There's this common perception, I think, that American economic history is basically the ultimate laissez-faire success story. Pure capitalism, minimal government, right from the start.
Yeah, that's the popular image, but the sources we looked at, they really challenged that simplistic view quite strongly.
How so?
Well, the reality seems to be that the vast majority of American classical liberals, especially in the 19th century, they did not interpret laissez-faire as meaning absolutely no government intervention ever.
They weren't purists.
Not really. They seem to have been much more pragmatic. They were actually quite comfortable using targeted state action when they thought it served the national interest, particularly when it benefited producers and promoted commerce.
Okay, so give us some examples. What kind of government actions are we talking about that seem to contradict that pure hands-off idea?
Oh, plenty. Think about the federal government setting up the Patent Office way back in 1802. That's direct government action to protect inventors' monopolies, essentially.
Right, incentivizing innovation through state protection.
Exactly. Or the Survey of the Coast started in 1807. That was the government actively mapping the coastline to make shipping safer and commerce easier. That's not exactly letting things be.
And these weren't just small things, right? We're talking about massive federal involvement later on, too.
Huge involvement. Think about the enormous land grants and subsidies given to railroad companies to build the transcontinental railways. That's direct government support on a colossal scale.
Or things like internal improvements canals, roads often funded or supported by the government. And what about the big banking debates?
Absolutely central. The creation and the intense political battles over the first bank of the United States and later the second bank. These were powerful government-chartered institutions designed specifically to stabilize the currency and actively shape the national economy.
So the American interpretation of let do often seems to have meant let the government help the people doing things.
That captures it pretty well, I think. And this tendency towards what we now call a mixed economy, a blend of private enterprise and government intervention, it actually accelerated after the Civil War.
Right, you see protectionism really ramp up, don't you? With huge tariffs.
Massive tariffs, things like the McKinley tariff, the Dingley tariff, later on these, were setting historically high barriers against imported goods, specifically designed to shield American industries from foreign competition. That is the absolute opposite of laissez-faire free trade.
And at the same time, government regulations started to expand too. It wasn't just about promotion anymore, but also control.
Exactly. You get the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887 aiming to regulate the powerful railroad industry. Then the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 trying to break up monopolies. So the idea of this pure, frictionless, unregulated market that the early physiocrats dreamed of, by the late 19th century in America, it was clearly long gone, if it ever truly existed in practice.
Which brings us closer to the modern era and thinkers who do advocate for that pure, uncompromising version, like Ayn Rand.
Right. Ayn Rand, the objectivist philosopher, founder of that whole school of thought based on rational self-interest, she represents that modern, hardcore advocacy for pure laissez-faire.
How did she define it?
For Rand, it was crystal clear. She defined it as the abolition of any and all forms of government intervention in production and trade, the separation of state and economics. Full stop.
So not just limited government, but basically no economic role for government whatsoever.
Precisely. And for her, this wasn't just about efficiency or practicality, it was a moral imperative. She viewed pure laissez-faire capitalism as the only moral social system because, in her view, it was the only one that fully respected and protected individual rights without any exceptions or compromises.
Okay, so Rand represents that capitalist extreme of non-intervention. But here's where things get really interesting, maybe even kind of mind-bending. The idea of pure non-intervention, getting the state out of the economy, it's also been claimed by thinkers on the political left.
It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? This is where you encounter concepts like left-wing laissez-faire or sometimes free market socialism or free market anti-capitalism.
Wait, free market socialism, how does that even work? Aren't those complete opposites?
It seems like it on the surface. But thinkers in this tradition, people like Benjamin Tucker back in the 19th century, or more contemporary writers like Kevin Carson, they make a very different argument. They argue that a truly free market, what they often call a freed market, emphasis on freed from state distortion, would actually be inherently anti-capitalist.
Okay, I need you to unpack that. How can getting rid of the state lead to socialism or anti-capitalism?
Their argument hinges on how they see current corporate power. They argue that the massive corporations and concentrated wealth we see today are not the natural result of free competition. Instead, they see them as creatures of state intervention.
State intervention creating corporate power.
Exactly. They point to things like massive corporate subsidies, government bailouts, state-enforced monopolies like intellectual property laws, especially patents, and historical land appropriations. They see all these as artificial privileges granted by the state that allow corporations to avoid true competition and extract excessive profits.
So their logic is, if you remove all these state interventions and privileges,
Then true, fierce competition would finally flourish, barriers to entry would fall, and without state protection, they believe these large hierarchical corporations couldn't survive. Power would decentralize, maybe leading to more worker cooperatives, smaller enterprises, a system that looks much more pro-labor and anti-capitalist in the conventional sense.
wow. So it's incredible. You have right-wing objectivists and these left-wing market anarchists both fundamentally wanting to abolish state intervention in the economy.
Yes, the mechanism get the state out is surprisingly similar.
But they predict radically different outcomes.
Mhm.
One sees pure capitalism, the other sees something closer to socialism.
It all comes down to whether you think current inequality is caused by too little market freedom or by market distortions created by the state. It's a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the problem.
Okay, but setting aside these more radical interpretations, the mainstream view of laissez-faire has faced some heavy criticism over the years, right? Starting with Keynes.
Oh, absolutely. John Maynard Keynes, probably the most influential economist of the 20th century, was deeply critical of laissez-faire as a rigid doctrine. He famously argued that the decision whether to rely on a market solution or to use state intervention, well, it must be determined on a case-by-case basis.
No universal rule, just pragmatism.
Exactly. For Keynes, blindly applying laissez-faire everywhere was just as irrational as blindly applying state control everywhere.
Yeah.
You have to look at the specific situation.
And there was also Karl Polanyi, who had a different kind of critique, more historical or sociological.
Yes, Polanyi, in his book The Great Transformation, argued that the very idea of a purely self-regulating market, completely separate from social concerns, is actually an aberrational, unnatural phenomena.
Unnatural.
Yeah. He suggested that markets, left entirely to themselves, tend towards social disruption, instability, and commodifying things that shouldn't be commodified, like labor or land. He believed society inevitably pushes back, imposing rules and regulations to protect itself from the destructive tendencies of unregulated markets.
Which kind of leads us to how the term is often perceived today, doesn't it? In modern economics, or just in general conversation, laissez-faire often seems to carry a pretty negative connotation.
It definitely can. It's often used almost as a synonym for raw capitalism or cutthroat capitalism.
Mm.
It can imply kind of disregard for broader social values, things like quality, durability, environmental sustainability, worker safety, basic human well-being.
Because the pure doctrine prioritizes profit and efficiency above all else.
That's the implication. The critique is that pure self-interest, without any external checks or balances or shared values, doesn't provide a mechanism for accountability for those wider social costs. Profit becomes the only metric.
And we really need to bring this full circle back to Adam Smith himself. Because even the supposed father of the system, he wasn't entirely comfortable with all aspects of capitalism, was he? He had his own moral concern.
That's incredibly important. Smith was very clear, especially if you read his other major work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which actually came before The Wealth of Nations.
What did he say there?
He essentially argued that the entire economic system described in The Wealth of Nations was fundamentally dependent on a pre-existing moral framework within society. Things like empathy, justice, fair play, rule of law. He believed society would utterly collapse without a shared morality and functioning laws.
So he never intended for his economic system to operate in some kind of moral vacuum. The invisible hand needed a moral glove, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it. He saw morality and law as the necessary foundation upon which the market could then function effectively and beneficially. He wasn't advocating for pure amoral self-interest running rampant.
So what we've really uncovered here is that laissez-faire isn't just some dry economic policy setting. It's tangled up in centuries of philosophical debate. It touches on the true nature of individual rights, the proper role, if any, of government, and even leads to these completely paradoxical definitions of what a free market actually is. Is it inherently capitalist? Or could it be something else entirely if the state truly stepped away?
It leaves us with a lot to think about.
Hmm.
And that really leads us to our final thought for you, the listener, to consider. If you take philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, who argued centuries ago that life without laws and government, the state of nature, is inherently solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Right, the idea that we need government for basic order and safety.
And if you also take Adam Smith's insistence that his whole economic framework depends on having shared moral values and enforceable laws already in place as a prerequisite,
Yeah.
well, it raises a really fundamental question, doesn't it?
Which is?
Can the total abolition of the state and all its interventions, which is the purest definition of laissez-faire, whether from the right or the left, can that ever truly lead to the harmonious and self-regulating system that its proponents imagine? Or must some level of government intervention, however minimal, always be necessary simply to establish and secure the essential moral and legal foundation upon which any functional market, any complex society has to be built in the first place?